My name is Raine. I was formerly of the Kauai Endangered Seabird Recovery Project. I've since graduated from the KCSC program. I've started my own business as of this year. So I'm now the Science Director of Archipelago Research and Conservation, or ARC, which is based in Hanapepe. And broadly speaking, I'm just doing the same things I was doing before. Still working with endangered seabirds on Kauai, but also broadening out a bit more now to deal with non-endangered seabirds and water birds across the Hawaiian Islands and the wider Pacific. So I've kind of expanded my remit a bit since last we talked. But endangered seabirds, I've worked on them on Kauai for the last 10 years. And prior to that, I was the conservation manager for BirdLife Malta in the Maltese Islands in the Mediterranean, dealing both with endangered seabirds there and broader bird conservation. And good to be talking to you guys again for a second year.
Awesome. Yes. We are thrilled to have you as well. This was one of the high points of our program last year. I know everybody really enjoyed it and got so much out of it. So I'm glad we can do it before the season starts this year. We're getting better. So.
Yeah, so I do have the presentation, which I guess some of you guys may have seen already, but some of you are new to this. Is that right?
Yes, it's only Malu and Melia and Trinette and Patty are returning veterans. So we have a bunch of new folks too.
Okay, cool. Well, for our returning veterans, I have switched up a little bit. There's probably 80% of it you've seen before, but there's some new stuff in there, new content in there as well to hopefully keep you entertained. But for the rest, I guess it's all new. So did you want me to launch into the presentation now or wait for anyone else?
Let's get started. I think we're good.
Okay, try to share my screen here. All right, and then, all right, can you guys see that?
Yes.
Yep. Okay, awesome. So this is actually a photograph of a Hawaiian petrel chick taken 3 weeks ago up in the mountains, and you can actually see his the little egg that he's hatched from. So he's that chick's about 3 weeks old. So I thought I'd start with a cute fuzzy picture to get us all going. So what I'm going to do for this presentation is just talk to you about the 3 endangered seabirds on Kauai, how to ID them, and then some of the threats that they face on the islands because they are endangered, and then kind of round it out with light attraction, which is what you guys will be working on, and the intricacies involved with fallout. So let's see. First, just a quick overview for seabirds of Hawaii. We are fortunate to have a large number of seabird species breeding in the Hawaiian Islands. We have 23 species, and that's over 12 million seabirds across the Hawaiian Islands. And the Northwesterns hold the largest populations, but unfortunately with climate change, we are looking at many of those islands in the future going underwater, which is the grim projection of climate change. And so when that happens, the main Hawaiian Islands are going to become even more important for these displaced birds. And we have a whole range of species from albatross, 3 species, shearwaters, petrels, storm petrels, boobies, tropic birds, frigate birds, and terns. Not all of them breed on Kauai, but we have a lot of them. And perhaps our most important bird is the one which you guys rescued 4 of last year, which was awesome. It's the a'o, or the Newell shearwater. The reason why Kauai is so important for the species is we have 90% of the world population here. So basically, if the breeding populations of the a'o disappear on Kauai, they're doing really badly across the whole of the Hawaiian Islands and the world. And they are listed under IUCN as endangered. And you can see that's on the left-hand side there on the top, that's 2 birds inside a burrow. All of our endangered seabirds breed in holes in the ground, like little rabbit holes, which is why they're particularly vulnerable to predators. And you can see there on that bird on the top picture that the a'o, it's very dark above, like a slaty gray above, and then really white below. And then when they're flying, which you won't see them if they're grounded, but when they're flying, you can see that on the bottom left, those little white thumbprints on the side, like a partial saddle. That's how you can identify them at sea. And the other thing is, when you're at sea, especially if you're fishing, you'll see huge flocks of wedge-tailed shearwaters. And the wedge-tails do a lot of soaring around. and they're in huge numbers. And then if you ever see a shearwater that's amongst them flapping really, really hard as if it's trying to stay up in the air, then that's probably a mules. So the mules are a lot more solitary than the wedgetails. And that's the two, so that's the mules and the wedgetail. And I do often hear people saying, well, there's so many shearwaters on Kauai, but what you're looking at is the wedgetail, which is Dua'u Kani. That's the one on the right-hand side. And you can see even from looking at those two pictures that they're quite different. The wedgetail is much grayer below. It's more smudgy looking and not as clear cut between the division of the darkness on the top and the white below. And they, like I said, they don't have those white thumbprints on the side when they're flying either. The wedgetail is our coastal shearwater. So you see lots of, there's quite a lot of colonies around the coast of Kauai where they're extremely vulnerable to dogs and cats. But they're our coastal shearwater. And then the mules are found up in the mountains, high up in the mountains. Then our second endangered seabird is the Ua'u. That's the Hawaiian petrel. And we have about 1/3 of the world population on Kauai. The other two main areas where the birds are found is Maui and Lanai. And they are, when you see them on the ground, they're pretty easy to differentiate because if you see on that top left, I don't know can you see the pointer on the screen? Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yes.
That there, you see the forehead's white. And the mules does not have that. So this white forehead is very distinctive when they're on the ground. They also have a much bigger bill. You know, if you get bitten by a Hawaiian petrel, they've got a lot more power behind their beak than a mule shearwater. And they fly a lot like wedgetails at sea. They're very, they're also quite solitary. But sometimes if you're at sea, you'll see this a Hawaiian petrel flying along, and they tend to take these really high loops across the ocean. So while wedgetails are staying really close to the surface of the waves, the Hawaiian petrels often get really high up as they're coasting over the waves, and that's one of the defining features of them. But as they fly at you head on, you'll often see that white forehead. They're also an endangered species and only found in the Hawaiian Islands. And then lastly, this is the one which people know very little about. This is the Ake. It's the bandrump storm petrel. They are probably, currently this species is thought to breed across the Atlantic and Pacific. It's got a really huge breeding range. But what this really is almost certainly a series of cryptic species. The storm petrels are really well known for, at first, appearing to be a single species found across a large global area. But when they start doing genetic studies of these birds, because they're all very similar to each other, it's often found that you have these cryptic species hiding amongst the global population. And we took part in a genetic study a couple of years ago and took blood samples from our populations of storm petrels. And it was found that our birds are most certainly distinct from all the other storm petrels, either a subspecies or even a species. So that's a work in progress as to whether they'll be reclassified as their own species. But it just highlights why it's important to protect different island populations, because this is probably a cryptic species. And on Kauai, they're very rarely seen. They breed on the Napali coast and also Lehua. And normally every year there's one or two that's found during the fallout period. And they're quite small. They're about the size of, I don't know if you guys know the wandering tattlers or even the kolea. They're a little smaller than that. So they're quite small birds. And they're, when you see them at sea, they flap a lot like they're kind of like a little bat. Very acrobatic, and they have this white rump right here. So they're really dark, and then you see this white rump, which is really distinctive when you see them up close. There has been a couple of birds found breeding on Big Island and Maui. So we think we think they're found on those islands, but only 4 nests of the species have been found ever in the Hawaiian Islands. So even though there's probably quite a few of them around, they're very, very hard to find. And it's because of their small size. And I've been in big colonies of Mediterranean storm petrels back in Malta, and even when there's thousands of birds around, when they hit the ground, they're like little mice. They run along the ground and they get into the smallest hole possible and they disappear, and you wouldn't even know you're amongst them all. So they're pretty cool. So this is the classic breeding habitat for the mules and the Hawaiian petrel. That's a mule's chick on the left and a Hawaiian petrel on the right. And obviously this is the kalalau. And the mules really like these sort of steep areas like this here. They like these steep aluhe covered slopes and cliff edges, Whereas the Hawaiian petrels, they like to be on the top of ridges in native forests, like with a lot of ohia and aluhe and lapa lapa, you know, all the main native wet montane forest tree species and understory. And they'll be often nesting on the top of the ridges and on the side of the ridges. And then on the Nepali, in an entirely different habitat, you'll have the mules again. So this is a mule's chick, and they'll be found on these super steep, barren slopes in these cracks and crevices along the cliff faces. And then this is where the storm petrels like to breed. So this is why, despite 10 years of searching for them, I've yet to actually get a camera into a storm petrel burrow, because it's extremely hard to get 1,000 feet down the side of the Nepali cliffs. I know they're there, and you hear them all the time, but it's just getting to them is really hard. So they're really challenging species to study. Firstly, there's the habitat they're in, which is, you know, really remote and often very, very steep. Secondly, on the islands, they only come in at night. So as the sun's setting, just after the sun's setting, you'll start to see the first Hawaiian petrels coming in. For example, if you go down to salt ponds and hang out there at dusk, every now and then you'll start getting the first Hawaiian petrel flitting over really fast as it's going up into the mountains. And then about 45 minutes later, you start getting your Newell shearwaters in pitch black, and those guys are then streaming over and heading up into the mountains. So they only come in at night, which makes them really hard. They live in these really remote areas now. And then during the day, they're way out at sea. They can be hundreds of kilometers away. And so understanding what they're up to at sea is also difficult and involves a lot of tracking work or boat-based observations. So they're definitely challenging, which makes them much more interesting than an easy to study species. And they face a number of threats on Kauai. So we found these huge population declines for these species using our radar surveys over the last few decades. A decline of 94% and 78% for the Newells and the Hawaiian petrel respectively between 1993 and 2013. So there's this massive population crash. And in the last decade, the population is sort of, you know, at this really low level, sort of just bumped along at this really low level. The huge population crash is over because the vast majority of the birds are gone, and now we're left with our remnant populations. And there's a number of reasons why. So the first is power line collisions. This is a conceptually an easy one to understand. You've got all the birds flying in from the sea and going up into the mountains to their breeding colonies, so in the center of the island, and they have to pass these power lines. And if you think about these birds having evolved, you know, over hundreds of thousands of years without humans, and then with nothing in their airspace, and suddenly you put these lines across their airspace, they fly really, really fast, 30, 40, 50 kilometers an hour, and they don't see these lines until it's too late and they hit them. And you can see here, you know, the horrific damage that some of these birds can receive if they hit a power line. This bird's head's completely caved in, or they get broken wings. But it's a sort of hidden threat, because basically the birds will hit the lines and then they'll drop, but they can drop a long distance away. So you don't necessarily find them. Like, this is a really nice, easy one to find, this bird here, which is on the road leading down to Eleele. But then most of the time they're not like that. And the really bad areas for these birds are up in places like the power line trail. And you can see if a bird hits this power line and drops into this vegetation, you will never see it. So it's a hidden threat, even though it's an easy one to understand. And so the way that we've been studying this over the last decade is to use these acoustic sensors. It's called a song meter. And basically it has two microphones attached on either side, and it records sound at night. And it'll pick up the sound of a bird hitting the line, which makes a sort of twanging noise as it hits. And then we can run that through an algorithm and figure out, okay, well, which are the really bad areas where there are lots of power line collisions? How bad is the situation in general? We found that there are thousands of collisions annually, leading to at least a couple thousand birds dying each year. So that's really bad. The good news is, though, that a lot of it's concentrated in key areas. So if you see on this map, the red areas are areas where there's lots of collisions. And you can see that there are few and far between the red areas and orange areas where there's lots of collisions, and they're very specific areas. So the good thing about that is then we can work with KUC to figure out how to deal with the power lines in those areas to reduce power line collisions massively. And we do have a couple of different ways of doing that. The first, and this is simplistic, you don't actually take a giant pair of scissors to the power lines, that would kill you. but you remove the power lines by undergrounding them. And obviously, if there's no power line in the airspace, then the bird's not going to hit it. You have a 100% decrease in collisions. But that is really expensive and tricky to do. So we worked out other ways. One of the things we were experimenting with has been to shine lasers across the power lines. These don't actually illuminate the power lines themselves, but they create this laser fence that runs in front of the line. And the idea is that the bird sees that before it sees the lines, and it goes up and over the fence and it doesn't hit the line. We found that was a really successful method, but it is quite tricky. It involves a lot of technology, and lasers don't like the sort of wet mountain environments, so they often fail. But what we've been doing a lot with now with KUC, and I'm sure you guys have seen these, is the diverters that are going up all over the place. These follow the same idea as the lasers in that they make the lines more obvious for the birds as they're flying along. Anything to give the bird more of a chance of seeing the line and reacting before it's too late. There's a lot of these out on the island now. KUC have been putting a lot out, which has been awesome. And there are two types. One is a reflective diverter, and they just have a little reflector on the end. And so any light that hits it, like the moonlight, whatever, will reflect and give it a little bit of a glow. And along the same lines, there's also ones which have a reflective strip, which absorb all the light during the day and then glow at night. And those are what have been being used along the roadsides. And then up in the mountains, we're experimenting with these LED ones, which actually flash a light. And when you think about light attraction, that's always been a concern with these things. You don't want to attract the birds to the lines. But because the lights are pulsed and low level, it should be just enough to give the bird that time to react and fly over them without attracting them to the line. So those are the kind of things we're working with KUC right now on. And I think this is going to be the answer for this whole power line collision issue, because if you can let the bird see the line with enough time to divert up and over it, you have no collisions and no problems. The second is introduced predators. Everybody knows all the introduced predators on this island, except maybe the barn owl. The barn owl was actually introduced in 1962 by the Department of Agriculture to kill rats. But barn owls decided that it was also good to eat our native seabirds. And so we have quite a lot of problems with barn owls. That's not to be confused with the pueo or the Hawaiian short-eared owl. Here's the rats. We've actually got three species of rats here. We've got black rat, Polynesian rat, and Norwegian rat. They can all be found up in the mountains. Feral pigs, which are scavenging animals, but will also dig into burrows because the burrows are on the ground and the birds are under the ground. Pigs have a really good sense of smell, and they will dig into the burrow and eat the eggs and the birds if they find them in there. And if a bird goes through a pig, I mean, it's like literally it's gone through a trash compactor. It's pretty crazy. And I know from my garden, pigs, as soon as you I have like a worm juice in my garden, you know, from composting. And as soon as you put out in the garden, the pigs are there that night. So they have an amazing sense of smell. And then public enemy number one is the cat, the feral cat, which you guys will see a lot of down in the Port Allen area. I mean, I'm personally a cat lover. I have an indoor cat. Cats are amazing animals, but when they're out in the anywhere else outside, not only is it bad for them because they get run over by cars, they get disease, they get in fights with dogs or other cats, they starve to death, but they also eat our native wildlife. And they are a very effective predator of seabirds. They also carry toxoplasmosis. I don't know if you guys know that disease, but it's a disease which has become in the news recently. It's well known for being actually a problem for humans. It can cause miscarriages in pregnant women. But also we've been finding now that Hawaiian monk seals are getting infected with toxoplasmosis from cat feces in the waterways or on the beaches. It gets into the sea and the monk seals get toxo and can die. And perhaps even more startling, they've found now multiple Hawaiian spinner dolphins that have died from toxoplasmosis as well. So that connection between a cat that you see in Port Allen and the death of a Hawaiian spinner dolphin is a pretty crazy connection, but is actually a solid scientific fact. So, and these are some grim photos here, but this is the grim reality of predators in the mountains. We see these are sort of the signs that we see of predated birds. So up here on the top left is the remains of a mule shearwater. This is just its head. This is a Hawaiian petrel that's been killed by a rat. You can see its throat's been torn out. It's been pulled out of the burrow. This is a classic kill from a barn owl. They like to take the head of the bird off and then strip the meat off the chest and then just leave it lying on its back. And then we also use a lot of cameras. Unfortunately, this is a pretty common thing for us to see in areas where there's no management, the cats pulling the birds out and killing them. So we use a lot of that information in our management areas. There are 7 management areas on Kauai now for seabirds. And by management, these areas are managed for predators and also for invasive plants. And they're managed to protect not just the seabirds, but native forest birds and also the watersheds themselves. And predator control is not carried out by my organization. There is another organization that does a lot of predator control. It's a really hard job, but it involves a range of different techniques. So everything from ungulate-proof fences to keep pigs out. Actually, you can see here on this, if you guys see that white line that's running on the top of the fence and another one here, this is what we use as a high visibility tape to make sure the birds don't hit the fence as they're flying in, because you wouldn't want that because you're trying to protect the birds. And then traps, there's various types of traps for cats, live traps, kill traps. There's this pretty impressive piece of equipment which came out of New Zealand called the Good Nature Rat Trap. These are really cool. You can, rather than just having a snap trap where once it catches one rat, that's it until you change it. These ones have bait that's up in here, and the rat will come trundling along and stick its head in to get the bait. It gets bolted, so it's a really quick, humane way of killing the rat. The rat falls to the ground, and then it just resets itself, and it can do that 24 times before it needs to be replaced. So those are really cool. And then for barn owls, there's we use well, the other organizations use tape lures and shotguns to at night to take out the barn owls. And that's a really tricky one because you have to be extremely careful not to target the short-eared owl, the Hawaiian short-eared owl, the pueo. And so it's only a technique that's used by highly trained professionals. And we use a lot of monitoring techniques up in the mountains to see how this whether this work is being successful. So this is Upper Limahuli Preserve, which is in the northwest of Kauai. All the blue spots are burrows of mule shearwaters that we found. We do a lot of night surveys, so we know where the birds are distributed. All that blue hatching is where we're hearing the birds. And then we use cameras. Like I said, the cameras are really useful for understanding what predators are up to and how many predators are coming into the site. We also use these acoustic devices that I was talking about for the power line collisions to hear the calls of the birds. And we relate the change in call rates over time to see if more birds are calling. If there's more birds calling, then management's successful. And then just monitoring the burrows. And this is a mule shearwater sitting quietly in its burrow on an egg. And we follow, it's over 1,000 burrows now across our management sites. We follow them every year. We check them 7 or 8 times a year, and we get their reproductive success rates as well as predation rates, and we see how those are changing over time. Really cool thing is within these management areas that with management in place, we're seeing all our call rates on all the sites are going up every single year, and our reproductive success rates are going way up, and our predation rates are going way down. And it's quite gratifying, having come here like 10 years ago and going to these sites. Most of the birds I was finding were dead. And now it's quite rare that we get a predation event, and our predator control teams are on it. So it's really great to see how effective management can be. The next level from predator control is predatory fences. And these are really expensive. They're basically, you can see here on the bottom right, this is actually the one at Kilauea at a place called Nihoku. And these fences, nothing can get in there, not even a tiny baby mouse. So they're totally protected. They have this hood on the top so that if a cat climbs up, it can't get over. And these become these havens for the birds. And we have started looking at predator-proof colony fences in the mountains. We've got a couple of small ones up now, but they are really hard to build, particularly in, you can see the terrain up there, it's obviously really steep and ridgy. And so trying to figure out places to put predator-proof fences is an interesting quandary. The alternative to doing it up there, though, is to do translocation and to build a fence in the lowlands. So this is actually that Nihoku fence at Kilauea. You can see this. I took this from the air, and there weren't any mule shearwaters or Hawaiian petrels in here. And so what we did over 6 years was we translocated 110 Hawaiian petrels and 86 mule shearwaters to this site, and we put them in artificial nest boxes. And then our partners at PRC would then feed the chicks for the last few weeks while they got ready to fledge. And as long as you take these birds out of their burrows before they emerge from the burrow for the first time, they imprint on the first place that when they come out of their burrows, the first place that they see, and they use the stars to do that. They have a star map. And so if you move them out of their burrows before they ever emerge and then put them in a new place and then they emerge in that place, the theory is that they'll return there. And so translocation is a really tricky thing to do, very expensive, but we managed to do that in this one site. And last year we had the first returning Hawaiian petrels. And then this year we had the first egg laid, which was really cool. It was a Hawaiian petrel. Unfortunately, the egg failed, but you know, often with a pair, they fail in their first year and then they get settled in after that. So we're hoping that that site there on the coast will become a big shearwater and Hawaiian petrel colony in the future. And the other thing is, instead of translocation, you can build small fences in areas where the birds aren't at the moment, but where birds are flying over, and you can use social attraction. They're very social birds. They like to breed in a colony. And so if you provide a safe haven for them in an area where lots of birds are flying around and you play their sounds all the time, you'll attract the birds down to that site. And then you can, in that way, you're sort of bringing them to your management site themselves, and then they're breeding in there and you can manage them in a much more confined area. So we have some very small social attraction sites that are going in. We've got one at Poakea in Hononapali Natural Air Reserve and a small one in Honopu. And we're looking at how you can develop these sites further. And they will also, they breed really closely together in their colonies. So you can fit a lot of birds into a very small area. And this is these are all techniques that are used in other parts of the world, particularly New Zealand. The other threat, another major threat, is introduced plants. It's always interesting to me to hear the tourists talking about how green the mountains are and how beautiful it all is. But when you look at a lot of these places, that, when you go up into the mountains and you actually look at the plants, you're looking at like a guava thicket, which, when it can often look like that, and the birds can't breed in something like that. None of our native species can breed in that. It's basically like a jail cell. Or the ginger. I know the tourists really love the ginger flowers. But the ginger is crazy. Like, it just creates these huge matted masses of ginger that it's impossible for a human to walk through, let alone a bird to burrow in. And this stuff can take over the native forest so quickly. I've done quite a lot of work on Lanai, and even in a couple of years, some of the valleys where there were birds and it was ohia and aluhe, it's now turning into a guava forest, and it'll become useless to everything except guava. And this is just an example. This all this area here was all ginger, and there was a poor bird breeding right there. So when this is in Upper Limahuli, when National Tropical Botanical Gardens guys came and started clearing all the ginger out, they found this burrow which was just being crushed by the weight of ginger. And luckily they managed to clear it in time, so hopefully that bird will now be able to nest properly. But yeah, it's amazing how quickly these introduced plants can take over the native forests. And of course, it has huge ramifications for our watersheds as well. I mean, like, the changing of the forest changes the water flow. The water, of course, is what we all rely upon. Then there's threats at sea. Like I said, these guys, they spend most of their lives at sea. They are seabirds. And there's a whole range of threats that they can face. This is things like plastics, overfishing, bycatch, changing climate change. Climate change is going to be a big one because it changes where the fish are. And these birds are fixated on certain parts of the sea, and they can only fly certain distances. We've done a lot of tracking of these guys to see where they go, because the first step in understanding the threats at sea is where are they foraging at sea. And you can see, for example, the mules with the A'o, they like to feed this is a colony on the north. They don't go very far. They go maybe 140 kilometers to get food for their chicks. And so they're concentrating a lot of their effort around this area on the north of Kauai. Whereas the Hawaiian petrel or the Oahu, it's pretty crazy. These guys, they do the male and female do this on and off feeding cycle. So the female or the male, one of the pair will be feeding within 3 days range of Kauai. So maybe like around this distance. And the other one flies on this huge arc up towards Alaska, and then curves back around again and comes back into the colony. And these journeys can take 3 weeks. And this is all, they go and they stock up on lots of food sources. This is a really important area for a lot of seabirds and cetaceans like whales and dolphins. They'll travel thousands of kilometers to get up here, and then they replenish their own energy sources, and then they come back to their chicks with this really energy-rich oil, which they then regurgitate to the chick. So the Hawaiian petrels have a much more complicated feeding and foraging strategy. And then in their wintering grounds, we tracked Newell shearwater chicks when they fledged over the course of 4 years, and all of them just head down to this area. It's about 2,500 kilometers to southwest of Kauai. It's actually an area where all these different upwellings converge. So you have all this, this mixing of waters, which is really nutrient rich. And all of our birds, they all end up in this one spot. And this is their first staging ground. And if you think about climate change and what that might do to these currents and where it might shift them, if all of our birds every year are going to one spot and that spot no longer becomes productive, well, that's basically the end of the species. So, you know, the climate change issue is a huge and concerning one. And also, I don't have a map for this, but it was pretty cool. Over the last few years, we've been tracking the Hawaiian petrel chicks, and those guys go all the way to the Philippines, and they spend their winter in the Philippines. They go into the South China Sea, they go up to Japan. So you think of our little Hawaiian bird that's been in this burrow, growing up in the mountains, fledges for the first time, and its first instinct is to go to the Philippines. It's pretty incredible to travel all that distance by itself because the parents aren't with them at that stage. So that's kind of like a whirlwind tour of other threats. We'll just talk now about light attraction because that's what you guys will be dealing with mostly. And light attraction is basically the concept of it is these birds, they breed in the darkness up in the mountains, and the only light they have is the stars. And then when they head out to sea for the first time, it's their first maiden voyage. They're using the stars to navigate. And what they'll see as they're flying over, and if you look at Kauai from above, and you look at the light, it's like a constellation of stars. And so they get attracted to these lights, and then you see them circling around like moths. And it's kind of like a tractor beam. It's always like, I feel like it's like Star Wars or Star Trek, you know, like when the big ship gets the little ship and sucks it in. Once they get on that light and they're around it, they just keep going and going and going. They've only got a finite energy source, then they end up on the ground. And then once they're on the ground, they either get run over, they get eaten by cats and dogs. And so these are two examples of bad lights. I would like to say that the one on the left, which is actually on A&B property in Port Allen, these lights were massively changed and they don't look anything like this anymore, which is awesome because these were like one of our worst lights in that area. And now all these lights are gone. You can see why these are bad because they're reflecting off all of the surfaces of the structures and just creating these big glows. Here's another light. This is at one of the hotels. I actually took this last year. You can see in that situation, the light's just pointing upwards. And what you really need with lights is dim lights that are pointing downwards, and there's no spillage of light coming up into the sky because that's what the birds are going to see as they're coming over. Or even if you have lights which aren't pointing up, if they're surrounded by a glowing wall or something, then it's just going to make everything light up. And this photo here is interesting too, because you can see there, maybe there's a cat. And there were a lot of cats around here at the time. I took this in like 2012. So this is like, I'm used this as a historical example now. But I actually found a bird sitting right there one year, and there was like 2 cats sitting around it. So they come out of the darkness, they're heading out to sea, they see these lights, they circle round and round. And this is the time period that they're doing it. This is their phenology. They're doing it from the end of September. This is the Newells to about mid-November. And the Hawaiian petrels are starting to fledge around mid-October, and they're ending up at mid-December. So we do have a long period of time where our fledglings are leaving the island and where they're vulnerable to light attraction. That's why light attraction and fallout, the searches are situated at the end of September through to mid to late December. There's one of the birds that I found there. You can see them right underneath the light. And it's kind of crazy because basically once they're on the ground, they have no idea what they're doing. They're firstly exhausted. And secondly, they're still like totally blown out by the light. So they'll just sit there staring at a wall for a while. And then if they land near roads, that's what happens. So they just get flattened. And I actually found a flattened wedgetail this weekend. It would actually hit a power line, but it ended up on the road and then a car just drove over it. So finding them before this happens is absolutely key. And the other threat, of course, is cats and dogs. Just a cat and dog will just take them out straight away if they can find them. This is SOS fledgling data. So these are the number of fledglings that have been collected by the Save Our Shearwaters project over the years. And you can see this totally coincides with this huge population crash. And if you talk to the guys who were working with these birds in the 80s and the 70s, I mean, they were like collecting 200 or 300 birds a day, which is insane when you think about it now, because now Save Our Shearwaters will get maybe 120, 140, something like that. And they were literally driving around the island, picking up 200 birds, throwing them off the cliffs because they had so many birds, driving back around the island, picking up another 200 birds on the way back, throwing them off the cliffs on this side, and it was just repeat cycle on the bad days. So it was pretty insane, the number of birds that were coming down. And you can see like that combined with all the other threats is why these birds have suffered so badly over the last decades. And what you're dealing with is a light attraction related to fledglings, but there is also light attraction to adults, but it's a very specific scenario. And I just quickly mention it. The only place we've really seen this is at the Kokay Air Force Station. And we became aware this was in 2015. There was this huge fallout of birds. When we went up there, you can see why, like these lights are, they'd gone green, which green is supposed to be a less attractive light to seabirds, but the lights were extremely bright. It was a foggy night, and you can see like how the light's basically just pointing up into the sky. And so we had just birds dropping all over the place. It was, I've never seen anything like it before. We got like 25 one night, and then the next morning we came back, there were another 20 on the ground. But I like these photos, and I think these photos are really useful for you guys because it really shows what the birds do. And so my experience up there with them in that night, which I will never forget that night because there were just so many birds. We went up there thinking we'd find a couple birds, and I drove back in the truck and I had like 25 birds in shoe boxes and like coming out of like, it was insane. I had too many birds by that point. And I said to them, you know, look guys, like there's probably gonna be more birds dropping out the sky. And no one was searching for them for the rest of the night. So the next day we went up, and what we found was that they've just all crawled into these tiny little hidey holes. So this is what they like to do, right? Like once they've landed, like the bird lands like this one here next to a fence, it's spent like a little while just staring around going, what the heck just happened to me? And then it's gonna seek shelter. And so they find these really tiny little places. So when you're looking for downed birds, obviously looking in the obvious open areas underneath lights is a really good search image, but also look down under hiding places because they will seek shelter once they've gotten over their initial like, oh my goodness, I don't know what just happened. They are going to go and hide. And they're like tiny little crawl spaces. Like this one's down here. These two are underneath this pylon. Here, in fact, that's the two of them before we pulled them out. They're just going to go and tuck in. The good news is at Kokay, you know, that's that first year, and that's actually just over the course of like a couple days. That's how many birds we got. We had 131 of the two species, mainly mules, 123 and only 6 Hawaiian petrels. But they then totally shut their lights down, 0 fallout. Then the next year they had the lights on at the beginning of the year, and I said, guys, you gotta like before we get to mid-April, you have to shut those lights off, otherwise you're gonna track birds. They waited until just the beginning of the season, got 2 birds that first night, shut the lights down. And since that point in time, they've used these really dim lights. And you can see we basically had nothing for years. It's actually become our most boring monitoring project because you just, you go there day after day and there's just nothing there. But we do have cameras out there, and we did find a downed bird in 2020. So it does also show that you just got to keep an eye out for them because they are endangered and every single bird counts. So lastly, with light attraction, I just wanted to explain to you like how it works with the moon. The moon is absolutely critical. Moon and timing is absolutely key with light attraction. And you can see here, this is the red is moon illumination, and the blue is fallout numbers in each year with Save Our Shearwaters. And this is a little dated slide, but anyway, it's good to show. You can see the take-home message from this when you look at it is red is if the moon is up and bright, you get very few birds. And then when the moon is dark, all the birds start falling out. So the birds are totally tied in with the moon. And that's because if the moon is bright, it overrides the artificial lights of our towns and villages. And if the moon is dark, then that's all the birds will see are the lights. And so they're gonna fall out when there's not a lot of moon. You may get the odd bird that just ends up on the ground during a full moon. It's really rare though. So obviously you've got to search every single night all the way through the season, but on those really dark nights, those are the nights to be like, okay, well, probably something's going to happen. And I plotted out this year's October for you guys. That's the illumination for October. And this is the mean fledge date is October 19th. So actually from a moon illumination point of view, this is should be a good year in that there should be not so many birds coming out, because as the birds are starting to fledge, there's going to be a lot of fledging around this time. There's going to be a nice full moon, so that's really positive. I didn't look at November. You should look at November and December too. But for October, which is the peak for the mules. That's what it looks like. So really your two time periods when you should be expecting a fair amount of action is going to be the beginning there where you've got low illumination. And this is going to be the first few birds are starting to fledge around here that first week. And then the last week of October around Halloween, you're going to start seeing them coming out again. However, the other thing to pay attention to is moonrise, the time of moonrise, because it may be a full moon, but if the moon hasn't risen until after the birds have started fledging, it's as if it's a dark night. And you can see here from October 23rd, the moon's not rising to 8:24. The 24th, it's 9:08 and so on. So I would say really that second search period where you should start getting quite a lot of birds, even though it's a fairly large moon, is going to be from about the 23rd of October onwards. And so that's a general rule of thumb. Like I said, you should always be looking for them everywhere anyway, because you never know. But I think those are going to be your times when you're going to get the most action. And the other thing to note, and this is from our cameras up in the mountains, is that there are actually two peaks of fledging at night. So you get this first big pulse of birds, like particularly at the very beginning of the night, all the way through here. And then you get a second pulse of birds fledging before dawn. That's why it's really important to pay attention to those two periods, because like I was saying before, the bird may hit the ground and sit there for half an hour, but then after that, it's going and it's going to hide. And then you're not going to find it if you search during the day, because it's gone and hidden itself really, really well. They're really good at doing that. So, and then as night falls again, you may find birds just suddenly emerging out of the bushes where they've been hiding all day, because now they're like, okay, it's dark again. And then like, oh no, there's a big light. And then you just stare at the light again and repeat cycle. So yeah, that's why, you do have these two specific pulses of fledging, with some birds fledging through the night, but there is a very distinctive early and late peak. And then just looking at the area that you're in, and these aren't the only areas where we used to find a lot of birds, and probably your experiences from last year, I don't know whether they match this or not, but the Port Allen, the dock here has always been a really important area for down birds, particularly I don't know if those lights are still there. There were some really bright lights on the dock. That was always bringing birds. And in fact, one of my guys was talking to a fisherman there who actually saw a bird fly into one of the wall mounted lights. Then this area here, we call this Nesh Corner or Newell's Corner, because it's kind of like there's all these lights and there's lots of lines as well. And so the birds, as they circle round and round and round and they get lower and lower, they start getting into the power lines as well. And then once they hit the power lines, they stall out. You can actually see them like stalling in the air. And then once they stall, they just drop. So this was a spot. There was also, I don't know if it's still there, was a big cat feeding colony here, which was really bad for the birds. And we'd find birds like tucked in underneath all these, the hedges and stuff around here too. The generating station has always had a couple of birds. I know KUC's guys search that at least twice a night. So they're broadly speaking on that particular area. That one's had quite a few birds in the past. The fuels areas over here used to have a lot of birds, but there were bright lights on it, and those lights have gone. So that's really good. And then you just find birds scattered about. And so we found them over a lot of these different areas. And like I said, it's always, you'll get them underneath the bright lights at first, and then they're going to go and hide. And then it becomes like an Easter egg hunt, but for endangered seabirds. So that's about it, I think, for me. At least that's my initial presentation. If you guys have any questions, I'll stop the share. I think you're on mute.
Sorry, thanks. Talking to myself. Yeah, no, that was great. And I didn't feel that repetitive. It was equally entertaining. So thank you so much for that. And do you guys, this is a great opportunity for any questions you have.
No question, but just a comment on the, I think we kind of got to the guy that was feeding all of the cats, and we did hire predator control for the cats. And, I think we've been successful, but the searchers will, point out if they see, because we did a tour and checked, and the last time they were leaving like all of the containers, and they're no longer there. So hopefully they're gone. So that'll help.
It's great news. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, back in the day, like a couple of years ago, some of those sites, there are multiple cat feeding stations around there. There's another one by Ace Hardware. I don't know if that one's still there, but there were like 30, 40, 80 cats one night at Ace Hardware. It's pretty crazy. So, and then there's just like food scattered all over the place, and yeah, it's pretty grim.
Yeah, that was probably our biggest data point last year, was collecting observations of cats. So, but you know, it's good. Hopefully that helped to make an impact, and it's good that we'll be out there again to see. Some other questions? I have to say, Andre, I was impressed with that rat killing thing that's up in the mountains that zaps them. But once there gets to be a pile of rats around it, is that a discouraging thing, or did they just keep going? And
rats like to eat other dead rats as well as everything else. So yeah, they'll like, and you get these horrible, like, they look like rat custard on the ground, like, because they turn to this oozy yellow grimness. And the other rats are just like, oh, what's this? And then they smell the bait, they head in. It was actually, those traps were created in New Zealand originally for the possum, which was introduced from Australia. And there's some, I mean, quite grimly fascinating videos on their website of possums, which literally one possum will come, stick its head in, gets nailed, falls to ground. Another one steps on the body of the first one, gets nailed, falls to ground. Another one, and there'll be like a pile of 5 or 6 of them, and they just keep going. So it would never work with something like a cat, of course, because cats are really cunning and really super smart, as anyone who has a cat like me knows. I mean, they will not be fooled by something like that. But rats, possums, and it's been really cool actually seeing, so they, up in the mountains, we have these grids of like 100 by 50, so they're spaced 100 by 50 across the whole area. And black rat numbers go way, way down. And the black rat is the one which eats the seabirds. But interestingly, the Polynesian rats, which are the smaller ones, their numbers start going up. And I think it's because the black rats eat the Polynesian rats as well as everything else. And so once you start knocking out the black rats, the Polynesian rats increase. And that's fine for the seabirds because the seabirds don't get eaten by Polynesian rats, but it could be problematic for some of the smaller forest birds or plants. Although the Forest Bird Project has been using these traps as well, and they've seen a positive impact on their reproductive success rates.
Yeah, amazing.
It definitely beats changing the trap every other day, that's for sure.
Right. Yeah. No, that is amazing. Any other questions? I have one more for you, Andre. You mentioned the area where you've resettled the birds, which is fascinating, the whole thing about how they implant on where they first come out. And you mentioned some came back. Was it like 100%, or how was your return rate?
Yeah, so these birds, they will, once they leave Kauai, they may not come back for 4 or 5 years, which is pretty crazy. I mean, they'll be out at sea all that time. And the only place, they're not going to touch any solid land for 4 or 5 years. It's pretty insane. They'll just like sit on the sea surface, they'll fish, they'll be off, you know, they could be in the South China Sea, they could be in the bays of the Philippines, then they come back. And so it takes a long period of time. And so we've just started seeing the first birds returning, which is kind of the timeline we were expecting. And I think we've had 8 or 9 Hawaiian petrels return so far. They also do have a fairly low survival rate in their first year. It's probably only about 1 in 4 of them survive, because if you think, I mean, that's quite a thing to do, to survive for 4 or 5 years by yourself with no one training you and catching flying fish and neon flying squid and never being taught how to do that. So they have a fairly low survival rate. But we would expect over the next few years, those numbers to start increasing as the last cohorts come in. And hopefully we'll start seeing the mules as well. But yeah, it's that first egg this year was cool. Even if it failed, I mean, it's a great sign that, you know, at least 2 or 3 of them were pairing up.
Yeah, no, just the fact that they came back, I mean, amazing.
I have a question, Andre. So when you say they don't touch land, are they just flying and then just resting in the water, the birds?
Yeah, they'll fly. It's called rafting. They'll all get together in a big group. In fact, you'll see the wedge-tails do that off the coast here sometimes. Like off Lehua, I've seen rafts of 6,000 birds. It's like just black across the sea. So they'll sit like that. But also when they're sitting on the sea, they're vulnerable to large fish predators like tuna, for example, will bite their legs off if they can get them, or even eat the bird. And so they also can shut off half their brain and go to sleep, like a partial sleep while in the air. So they'll cruise around and like be on like cruise control for a while and shut on and off. And things like frigate birds are even more amazing because they'll go huge distances up into the air and then just go to sleep and just cruise around like fast asleep, hopefully not encountering a plane.
Amazing, amazing. So cool. All right.
I mean, we're still in Hanapepe, and if you guys ever like need anything during the season, or if you find something and you don't know what to do about it, like I'm sure you guys have your own protocols, but just we're happy to help in whatever way you guys need. And I think it's really cool that you guys are actually doing this because it's I mean, it can be quite a grinding thing to walk around night after night not find anything, but there's also that one chance if you find that one bird or two like you did. You've saved 2 endangered seabirds, and that's pretty amazing because they're guaranteed those birds would be dead if you didn't find them and rescue them. They are going to die. So giving them that extra chance, and we've tracked shearwaters that Save Our Shearwaters have released, and we know that they survive. Some of them will survive when they go out to sea, and so it's a pretty gratifying thing to be able to save one of the rarest seabirds on the planet and know that it's out there because of you. So yeah, that's really cool that you guys are doing it.
Awesome. Well, that's great. I can't thank you enough, Andre. We'll definitely be in touch if we can. And yeah, it's just such a great overview for everybody. So thanks again for sharing all your knowledge and experience. It's great. So cool.
Yeah, no worries. Happy to help.
Thank you. Good job.
Right. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, guys.
Good luck out there.
Okay. Look forward to seeing you folks soon.
Bye.
Okay. Take care, guys. Thanks again.